Hey everybody, so welcome to chapter 4 here, Making of the West, chapter 4, from the classical to the Hellenistic world as we continue with the Greeks. Continuing here with the Greeks. I think it's our last chapter on the Greeks, and then we'll move into the Roman world. Okay, so from 400 to 30 BCE, so about 400 years, give or take. Classical Greece after the Peloponnesian War. Remember, that's that war between between Athens and Sparta, which Sparta does eventually win. So Athens' recovery after the Peloponnesian War. So this chapter really focuses on what we call classical Greece, that is after the Peloponnesian War. And then it will get into, at the end of the chapter, what we'll refer to as the Hellenistic period, which is the period of Hellenism. What is that? As I'm going to explain, that's basically the time when Alexander comes down, conquers the Greeks, and then Alexander spreads the Greek culture all through mostly Asia, Africa into Asia. That is what we call Hellenism, the spreading of the Greek culture, and therefore the spreading of Hellenism is the Hellenistic period. Okay. All right. So this is about 400 years before the Greeks are consumed. Pretty much where this chapter ends is when the Greeks are actually consumed and taken over by the Romans. And therefore the next chapter logically moves into that. We're going to look at the rebirth of Athens here. We're going to look at the rebirth of Greek culture following the war. And then, of course, the conquering by the Macedonians, even Alexander is considered, he spreads this Greek culture. Alexander isn't Greek. They are Macedonian, which is not really Greek. It's really European. Yes, I know, we're quibbling over terms, I suppose, because Greece is part of Europe. But culturally, the Greeks didn't consider Macedon to really be Macedonian. And the Macedonians were very dismissive of the Greeks. Nonetheless, we will get into it. So after this 30-year Peloponnesian War, which ended the Athenian Golden Age, and with Sparta victory and the cities devastated, the countryside's devastated, the mines are destroyed, pretty bad. A 30-year war is obviously bad. Much of the country was left in ruins. Many people left the city. Athens was almost depopulated. Half of the city burned down, walls destroyed, its great glory and honor diminished. The great shining beacon of Athens was dimmed. And many people sort of moved away from Athens thinking it was over. The great glory was over. Well, they weren't quite right. It does come back. It does return. It may be not as great as it had been before the war, especially under Pericles, but it does return, it seems. But many brothers and husbands and fathers didn't return. Many women had to go find work outside the home. We see many women taking a more active role in society outside the home. Remember, women were often secluded. Women were often protected for property rights, or just the fact that women were considered the weaker sex. Now, many parts of Greece have been depopulated because tens of thousands of warriors have died. So the women have to step up and do a lot of this work. We see private businesses being run and taken over by women. We see an increased trade, manufactured goods out of homes, fewer shops. Many streets in Athens are simply empty. The entire street depopulated. The shops are closed or in ruins. So many people sell out of their homes. Yeah, the economy takes a huge hit and sort of goes back, maybe loses a century or more. It didn't end, though. It didn't devolve into total, like a dark age again. It took a huge hit and then does start to slowly recover. Athens really went from what we would think of as a state economy, pretty much the entire economy run by the government, all for the needs of the empire, to more of private industry and really private business, to where people are taking care of themselves. Less powerful, but still viable. Certainly not as powerful as it had been. As the prosperity does return, as the economic recovery does return into the 300s, we see cloth weaving become a big business, pottery becoming big business. We see increased increased rights for workers. We see many of the metics, the foreigners, becoming Athenian citizens, taking up roles of Athenian citizens. We see a blurring of the classes to some degree in Athens, as there's almost this feeling that everyone just has to do their part to try and rebuild the city, which much of it was in ruins, the countryside in ruins. We see that. One of the major great victories was starting to rebuild the long walls. Remember the long walls? That's what connected the city to the port. And of course, the port, which had been the center of Athens' economic power, their shipping industry. So once they rebuild the long walls, because all along the walls had actually been markets and shops, they start rebuilding that. They rebuild the port. And by the 380s, 390s, Athens is starting to recover. They rebuild the trade center. They rebuild the markets. They start rebuilding ships again. They try to reconstruct the entire navy. So, still though, over the next 20, 30 years, even though the Athens as a whole does start to recover, we still see widespread poverty and homelessness. The Golden Age would probably never return quite the way it had been. These are silver coins. Silver coins of Athens. Here we have this representation. It basically represents Athens' authority. We have Athena here on one side of the coin. That is the goddess Athena, of course, the patron goddess of Athens. On the other side, we have an owl. Well, Athena was seen as the goddess of both authority and wisdom. So one side shows her face, which is, as we'll see in history, many, many emperors put their faces on coins. The face is the symbol of authority. That is the authority, the face. And then the flip side is the owl, which shows her wisdom. She was this goddess in wisdom and authority. It also was one of the first internationally accepted currencies. That's of note because it was an actual precious metal. Like we see currencies in some other places, like in China, the first metal currencies they were making was iron coins. So that's not really a precious metal. This is a precious metal. Another thing which made Athens coins so valuable is they were made of generally solid silver, which meant the coin itself was valuable. It could be traded. You could literally, if you needed to, melt it down and it had value. You could make a gold ingot out of it, or pardon me, silver ingots out of them. So the coin itself was valuable. Like in our modern society today, the coins that we have in our coinage, they have no actual value as far as the metals. The metals that are in a coin is less than the actual value of the coin. The metal that's in a quarter is only worth a penny or two. The coin itself really has almost no value. Its value is because the state says a quarter is a quarter. That's where the value of a quarter comes from. It's backed up by the government. These coins actually had just intrinsic value. They were like solid silver, stuff like that. It was really important because it was part of Athens' reputation of authority and power. If you could get varied governments in other states to accept your currency as legit, and because, of course, if the currency is legit, then you're sort of, by association, accepting that the government and that the state is legitimate and worthy of doing trade with. So once Athens recovers from the war, they're able to reopen all those silver mines which were destroyed or caved in. They start trading again. They start minting more coins, and this is one of the steps in their economic recovery. Here we have the long walls. This actually comes from, you could see this image in the previous chapter we talked about it. So once they rebuilt these walls, it allowed Athens to be reconnected to Piraeus, which allowed merchants and shops to reopen all along the wall. It allowed the shipping industry to be restarted. Another thing you can see here is the Academy and the Lyceum. Both of those I think we'll end up talking about in this chapter. Founded by the great philosophers, a couple of the great philosophers in Athens history. Interesting stuff. All right. Philosophy of Plato. Now, your book talks about Socrates. You could look at that. You could look at Socrates. Lots of people are upset with Socrates. He's eventually forced to commit suicide. Charged with angering the gods. Socrates was tried by jury in 501, and he was given the option of either exile or execution. And because he was an honorable or an upper class citizen, he was given the opportunity to simply leave the city and never come back. He decided to die for his beliefs. He stays, and eventually he's forced to drink hemlock, which is poison, and kill himself. They actually asked during the trial if he would simply leave, if he would simply accept exile, and he said no. Yeah, it's really interesting. He even said during his trial that he expected a reward for the teaching he was doing. He didn't think he should be on trial for impiety, for challenging the gods, for corrupting the minds of the youth. Really what it was, he was embarrassing lots of elder statesmen. And so anyway, drank poison, and he was quoted as saying something to the effect of, "No evil can befall a good man in life or death." In other words, if you're good, you're good. Doesn't matter. No evil can ever invade your soul if you're a good person. Many people considered him a hero. Now, his student was Plato. That's where we get to Plato here. The death of Socrates caused his most famous student, Plato, to really turn against the idea of democracy. He believed this democratic state had actually killed his mentor. His pseudo father had actually killed him, and that democracy, which Socrates actually talked about and thought was a good thing, Plato was a little less concerned with democracy, thinking that the people, because the jury was chosen from the people. The jury was actually, it's sort of very similar to how we choose juries today. It was supposedly a jury of his peers. People were chosen by lottery, random choice, sort of like today. And he said that's what democracy gets you. Democracy gets the masses, in his view, the people, the jury, killing great people, killing a great man like Socrates. So he lost faith in the idea of democracy. Of course, this is an incredibly narrow view. Democracy is far more than a jury trial, and which is actually, they gave him a choice to leave. He could have just packed up his shit and got out of town. But no, he had to stay and die for his principles. That's his decision. He devotes pretty much the rest of his life to contemplation of the nature of reality. Good luck with that, right? I mean, any of you think about it? It's just, I'll spend my life contemplating the nature of reality. Wow. That might keep you busy forever. So around 386, he establishes a school. 386, that is his life there, from around 429 to 348. He establishes the Academy, which you saw on that map a minute ago, which was in Athens. It's a philosophical school, attracts a lot of students from around the world. And at the time, the world is Africa, Europe, Asia, Afro-Eurasia. So it attracts people from around the world to come and study at the school. It is one of the most impressive structures and places of learning ever built. It stood for almost 1,000 years. The Academy was a functioning school at different times. It was, probably wasn't a school the whole time, but for most of the time it was a functioning structure and school for the better part of 1,000 years. Until pretty much the end of the Roman Empire. Around the end of the Roman Empire is around the time the Academy is destroyed. So yeah, quite impressive, this building. And it is influential upon later philosophers and literary artists in American history, for instance. We have things built, what we call academies, in the 1800s in America. Part of, I think, existentialism, and part of some different movements that we see in the 1800s in America. We build our versions of the academies. 1800s? I'm going to go with 1800s. He reported his ideas in dialogue. Everything Plato wrote was in dialogue. In other words, a conversation. He wrote it always as a conversation between him and someone else. sometimes speaking with gods, speaking with spirits, speaking with the dead, speaking with great people from history, speaking with Socrates. And it was, in essence, an argument, a debate between him and the other person every time he wrote these dialogues. And it was all about talking about reflection and meditation, and not to agree to one set of beliefs, and having an open mind and a willingness. All things that he thought the jurors didn't have when they executed his mentor. It convinced him that there are ultimate universal realities in the world. They are changing, they're absolute, and they're not relative. Meaning there are absolute rules, absolute philosophical ideals that do not change based upon time or social class, rank, wealth. They apply to everybody. Absolute rules. Well, it takes sort of a rough turn because he also believes in absolute justice. In other words, everything is what we would say, use the term black or white. It's binary. It's either true or untrue. Either you're guilty or innocent. There is no middle ground. There is no gray area, and there is only one right decision. Everyone is either guilty or innocent. Everyone is either this or that. And it's really important through reflection, through contemplation, through study, to determine the truth of all things. And, for instance, in the cases of justice, if you're found to have committed a crime, a real crime, then you need to be punished to the utmost extent of the law. But he believed absolutes applied to everything. And now, how did that apply to his mentor, for instance? He didn't believe Socrates committed a crime. He was innocent. But if you did commit a crime, you should be punished severely. But he believed it applied to justice, beauty, equality, goodness, everything. And he said there was this absolute in this metaphysical realm, and generally what we call these are what we call forms. This idea of forms. The fact that there is an ideal beauty, a love, justice, there's a perfect form. It's binary. It's either perfect or imperfect. No in between. And there is a perfect form of everything. Forms. And most people don't understand or are not able to view forms. Most people are not able to understand the true perfectness of reality. Whatever it is, literally love, justice, law, how to plant a garden. Anything, there's perfect forms. And that's why democracy is bad. Could you see why democracy would be bad? Because democracy is the masses of people making decisions. Under Plato's view, very few people have the proper learning, the proper knowledge to see the perfect forms. Therefore, how can you expect the people to make decisions when most of them are not capable of seeing the perfect forms, of having perfect understanding, because they don't spend their lives in study and contemplation and school and learning and knowledge? This becomes a situation to where society should only be ruled or controlled by the elite few, not the masses. Definitely anti-democratic. This is not an uncommon view. This is a view probably a lot of America's founding fathers had. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they were Platonists. That's what you would call someone who studied Plato, Platonist. But many of our founding fathers did not believe in democracy. George Washington did not believe in democracy. So, I mean, like in America, democracy, our idea of democracy today is not at all what was envisioned by our founders. Because most of them, no, all of them were elitists. They didn't believe that common, regular people should be making important decisions in our society. So that's what this is. This is not really democratic. And it does actually move Athens. I'm not saying Plato necessarily himself moves Athens away from democracy, but Athens and Greece in general completely move away from democracy over the next century, really. So I guess Plato's ideas are not in a vacuum. Maybe there's other people that have similar ideas, and Plato's very influential. So other people have similar ideas of how democracy might have actually been at fault or contributed to Athens' defeat to the Spartans. Athens's weakness to be conquered by many people would have thought a inferior competitor, the Spartans. He also argued that most humans cannot understand or directly figure this absolute reality of goodness or justice. Often that human senses weren't capable of really, without lots of contemplation and study, you couldn't really ever see the perfect forms. He also develops a concept of dualism. Humans possess immortal souls. He's maybe the first person in Western civilization to really do this philosophically. Don't get me wrong, like even the Egyptians thought, you had a soul that could go to an afterlife. But that was like it's not the same thing. That was like you were simply living another life. Plato comes to this idea of how you are an immortal soul that is separate from your body. It's a total separate soul that is immortal, separate from the body. What's that sound familiar to? Christianity. Greek philosophers were heavily influential upon the development of Christianity and what Christianity became. Many of Jesus' apostles lived and traveled around Greece at the time the Bible was written. So, yeah, even though it's centuries after this idea of dualism is inherent in Christianity, for instance, which comes from the same part of the world. In his dialogue, The Republic, he writes about the ideal government, which would be an enlightened oligarchy or monarchy. In other words, a rule by an elite few, those that could truly understand the nature of reality. No democracy. No. We don't want the masses, common people making important decisions. They simply aren't knowledgeable enough to do it. Convenient, puts the power in the hands of the few. Democracy can't give justice. People can't get past their own narrow self-interest. They can't understand ultimate reality. And at the end of the day, people are selfish. Which, true, generally. And to really serve society, you have to be willing to put the needs of the many above the needs of yourself. Ironically enough, in elitist governments, which all through history, those governments which are run by the few, run by kings, a monarchy, or an oligarchic few of people, they don't really seem to put the needs of the many above themselves. Usually they seem to put the needs of themselves above the many. Under Plato's view, it would be a perfect society where this elite group at the top would basically take total care of everybody else, make all the right decisions. It's very idealistic and naive. Well, Plato's Republic really describes this ideal society, where the whole society is broken up into these three classes. There's three classes in society: the guardians, the auxiliaries, the producers. And I'll get to utopia. This was a utopia. This was meant to be utopia, which today is a term we use for like a perfect world, a perfect place. It's perfect. Utopia. Well, the guardians were the ones who were the educated elite, math, astronomy, and physics. They ruled basically as philosopher kings. In other words, academic kings, academic leaders. Think like a university professor running the government. That kind of thing. Then the auxiliaries, these are the warriors, the defenders, the ones who defended, which today a common term used for soldiers, protectors of like the home area of like a government or a state, the capital. Today we might even use the term National Guard, but in earlier years a term auxiliary would have been used. These are people who were the protectors, the guardians of the government. Not necessarily the soldiers who went out and fought in the fields, but the ones that protected the cities and the capitals, the auxiliaries. That's what these were. And then the bottom were the producers. That's everybody else. They're the ones that make everything. It was a class society created. And of course, interestingly enough, where do you think Plato would have fit into this? Yeah, obviously he would have been a guardian. He would have been a philosopher and an intellectual. I'm sure he would have been at the top. Somehow I don't think he would have created this perfect society if he'd been one of the producers living at the bottom. Probably not. There are some interesting aspects of utopia. He did say men and women are equal. Neither could possess private property. Children are raised communally. Um, there wasn't a nuclear family. In other words, there wasn't a family. Everything was communal. Now, he did make it pretty clear he didn't think this was possible to happen, that this wasn't something that could really happen, but what he did believe is that we should always be striving towards this. It's a goal, an ultimate goal, if you will. He believed this would create a just, perfect society. The closest thing we might have to this today is socialism or communism. Really communism, not just socialism, but real communism. Which thing is, the reality is communism turns out to have sort of this look of this guardians, auxiliaries, and the producers, with the elite at the top. Here's the problem. It's exactly as I just said a couple minutes ago. The elite really aren't there to take care of the masses. The elite take care of themselves first, while everyone else suffers. That's what often happens in communistic societies. On paper, it looks great. Everyone gets what they need. Everyone should be happy. Everyone content. Everyone's got a job. No one wants for anything. But there's also no motivation to be better because you're stuck in your position. It's a class society. All of the spoils of society, all of the luxuries of society go to just the guardians. They get everything. Yeah. It sounds nice, but if an actual society existed like this, I don't think it'd be a utopia. It'd be for the guardians and auxiliaries, that would probably be pretty good. But for the producers, which is most people, life would be generally just gray. You would have nothing to live for, no motivation, no social mobility, no way to generate wealth, and not to mention education. Education is really only important for the guardians and their elite. Everyone else, education, not that important. You can see how this could quickly go off the tracks if anyone ever tried to implement this. But this is, in many ways, sort of an aspects of modern ideas of some ideas of socialism, communism specifically. Well, his student was Aristotle. Aristotle came to study at the academy. After Plato's death, Aristotle became a scholar and a tutor. Interestingly enough, he actually became a tutor of Alexander the Great, which we will get to in a little bit. So he was one of the people who trained and educated Alexander. He returned to Athens. He founded his own school, the Lyceum. We have this also happen in America. We have a Lyceum movement that appears, again, I think 1800s, somewhere in 1800s, we have this Lyceum movement that appears. Aristotle emphasizes, so thousands of years later, we still have these influences of Greek philosophy upon our American society, for instance. Aristotle emphasizes logic, scientific knowledge, practical experience. He rejected Plato, and he believed there was no perfect unseen world. All of that utopia idea was garbage. It really didn't make any sense. Metaphysical teachings that aren't the real world. He said everything had to be based on, everything had to be explained, everything had to be rational, logical, common sense, no metaphysics, no pie in the sky, perfect world. Well, the world we have is the world we see. That's our world around us. This is the world we live in. We got to simply work to strive and make this a better world, not go for these weird ideals. And he was more democratic. Aristotle was more democratic than Plato was. He based his ideas on common sense, observation. He believed to be most compatible. He was really the beginning of natural philosophy, which becomes later what we will call science. So he might be one of our first scientists, or the first scientist in Western civilization. He believes logic, experience, study, experimentation, all these things are required. That's the basis of science. Observation, experimentation, that is the basis of modern science, really. So he really thought the ideas of biology and zoology, which is studying, like plants and animals and humans and everything. Well, botany is plants. Zoology and biology. He believed all of this together was his life's work. studying how people and animals lived and studying them and observing them. As I said, he pretty much rejected everything Plato did. He rejected his forms. And in essence, he completely denies any world we can't see, which does get him in a bit of trouble. Even though he is certainly more, I have anti-democratic on here. He was more democratic. He was more democratic than Plato was, less than Socrates, if you will. He still criticized common people who were uneducated. He said you needed to have education to really be a leadership position. But he didn't advocate for a monarchy or an oligarchy and a rule by the elite. He said the society simply should be ruled by educated people. Not necessarily an elite group, but at least a smaller number of people who have dedicated their life to like government. More of like the creation of a he wouldn't use this term, wouldn't really call it that, but the idea of basically like civil service. You can govern, you can have authority, you can have power, but you need to be trained. You need to be educated. You need to have some type of training, which is certainly much more broad than what Plato said, but still not exactly democratic, really. All this together, we sort of call these Aristotelian ethics. The criticism of democracy, of the masses, the study, the experimentation. He does believe in the inferiority of women and slaves. He is okay with slavery. Nothing unusual there, though. Slavery was standard practice in Greece, all early civilizations. So even the fact that he approved of slavery is really, I don't know if it's really something that we wouldn't have to even mention, really, because just about everybody would approve of slavery. Slavery was simply a common practice. We have almost no instances of people in early civilizations really rejecting slavery. It was just part of normal life. And reaffirming that women are inferior to men also was common. Women were rarely ever treated or given any type of equal status. But these are anti-democratic, potentially. Obviously, slaves don't get to participate in democracy, and this affirms further that women don't get to participate in democracy. So it's still a society that is of an educated elite who are really running the show. He also advocated that people should use their intellect to reach what he called, quote unquote, the mean. In mathematics, mean is an average. It's a type of average. It is pretty much the exact middle of a group of numbers, this mean. Pardon me. He believed people should suppress strong emotions in either direction. You should suppress strong emotions of joy and excitement, and you should also sort of suppress emotions of extreme emotions of anger or sadness or anything. You should pretty much try to stay sort of in the middle. Moderation in all things. Moderation in all things. And he also believes this ethical society must exist, and it has to exist, and I'm still on that Aristotelian, it has to exist for society to move forward and be successful. We must be ethical and logical in our thinking. We must observe. We must not let our emotions get the better of us. Yeah, it's interesting. It's much more of a moderate appeal than Plato had, but it's also moderate away from Socrates as well. Socrates was ultra democratic, believed that all the people should be able to have a say in society. He believed that you should constantly question authority and challenge it, even physically if necessary, if you got that far. So he advocated for more democratic ideas, and of course Plato was opposite of that, and Aristotle's more in the middle, more moderate in the middle between the two of them. Quite interesting. Next thing we'll talk about is the Macedonians. So Macedonian power in Philip II from 359 to 336 BCE. Macedonia was just north of Greece. It was thought to be a minor power in the region. Nothing all that significant. This changes under King Philip. King Philip, he organizes Macedon and a bunch of smaller kingdoms and lords under one banner. The way leadership in Macedon worked is the king only had power, and this was their traditional way of working, if the lower kings, so I guess they had like a high king and then they had lower kings, if the lower kings believed the high king was ruling justly, and so the lower lords, the lower nobles had to support the high lord, the high king. So to demonstrate their power, kings would participate in all the favorite pastimes of the rich and wealthy lords. Fighting, hunting, drinking. You had to display your prowess martially with weapons. You had to display feats of strength and strategy during war, for instance. Women often achieve status through family line. Typically influenced through family and through their children. It was a little bit different than the way Greece worked. Education wasn't really an issue. Religion wasn't really that much of an issue. And they really respected power and strength and might. That's really what mattered more than anything. A little bit more of a throwback to a traditional warrior society. Maybe more like the ancient Greeks were, a little more like that. Well, they had a lot of pride, a lot of ethnic pride. They believed Macedon was superior to everyone else. Common theme in the past. Everyone thought they were superior to their neighbors. They viewed themselves Greek by blood. They thought of themselves as Greek, but they considered themselves superior to the other Greeks. The civilized Greeks, because Macedonians were really warrior. They didn't build big cities. They were very tribal still. And they thought the educated, philosophical Greeks that studied and had big cities and temples, that was easy living. They considered the Greeks to be inferior. The Greeks didn't consider the Macedonians to be Greek, though. They did not. Well, they saw them more as like barbarians. They looked down on them. And so generally, Macedon and Greece were hostile to each other. Now, Greece was much bigger than Macedon. But of course, after the Peloponnesian War, the Greeks were pretty fractured into lots of different city-states that were really competing with each other. That really left the door open for the Macedonians. The Macedonians were able to come in under Philip and start to conquer Greek city-states, to make alliances with Greek city-states in the north part of Greece, which eventually creates a lot of power and authority for Philip, King Philip. There were lots of similar languages spoken among the Greeks. I guess I'll say it differently. The Greeks and the Macedonians spoke a similar language, is what I mean to say. Even though it is considered different, it's close enough they could communicate with each other. But due to this competition, due to this both feeling the other was inferior to them, it led to growing hostility in this time period. King Philip the First, the original king, is the one who really starts to unite Macedon under one authority. He dies. His son, King Philip II, is the one who actually creates a Macedonian Empire. Alexander's often given credit for this, but he did not do this. His father, his grandfather started at Philip I. Philip II really consolidated most of Macedon and most of northern Greece. Most of northern Greece was also conquered by Philip II, or made alliances of. This happened by the 350s. And then to seize power, what Philip did around 359 He conquered a group of Illyrians. It was a neighboring tribe, a neighboring group of people, Illyrians, and slaughtered many of the Illyrians and conquered their entire population, which this is in northern Greece as well. His father, Philip I, had actually lost to the Illyrians as part of his expansion. So Philip II was payback, if you will. Payback for what they had lost. He creates a new army. He creates a new military order. He equips them with long spears. He teaches them to move in formation and use shields. By the way, those are all the tactics the Spartans used, which made the Spartans at one point, well, no, for a long period of time, they were the most powerful infantry in all of Greece. So what Philip II does is copy the Greeks' military style after conquering the Illyrians and making alliances with other Greek city-states. Seeking glory for Greece and fearing instability that would be created, Philip decided to lead a combined Macedonian and Greek army against the Persians. And this happens in the 340s. So he has not conquered all of Greece, but he's conquered about the northern half of Greece, or made alliances. He leads this combined army of Greeks and Macedonians, led by the Macedonians, against the Persians. Now, many people in Greece, for instance, the cities of Athens and Thebes, they were unwilling to join with Philip. They were unwilling, Philip II, unwilling to join with him, and they actually try to rise up against him, believing he is going to conquer them. He fights back. He defeats them in 338, and by 338, Philip has, in essence, conquered almost all of Greece, or forced subjugation of Greece, including Athens. And now most Greek lands are under the authority of Philip II. Now, let's step back like 1 minute and look at that Persian attack. One of the ways that he actually got many, many Greek city-states to simply ally with him, to form alliances and to join him willingly, was because of their age-old enemy, which had been the Persians. Persians had been a thorn in the side of the Greeks for centuries. So generally speaking, if you came in and said, I have an army, I'm going to go fight the Persians, will you join me? Many Greek city-states voluntarily chose to join, accepting Philip as their king, or I don't know what you want to call it, king, emperor, whatever. I think it went by king at the time. Well, using those armies that were originally put together for the purpose of fighting the Persians, he actually uses those armies, those Greek armies, to conquer the rest of Greece, including Athens and Thebes. It's an interesting game of chess that goes on for over 20 years in northern and central Greece, between the Macedonians and the Greeks. At times, Philip seems to be their friend, their ally. Other times he's conqueror. Other times he forms business partnerships. It isn't just simply conquering. That we leave to his son. Alexander is Philip II's son. Alexander is a conqueror. Philip was more of a... He conquered them, you're wrong. He did some conquering, and you know, he massacred some many. Like Illyrians, it was bad. He tore up the Illyrians badly. But they had previously had defeated the Macedonians at one point. His father, Philip I. So anyway, ultimately he conquers most of Greece, not all of it, but most of it, and forms a massive Greek army. Massive, we don't really know how big. It was big though. How big? Well, big enough to conquer the ancient Persian Empire, which at the point was maybe the biggest, largest, most powerful empire in the world. And Alexander conquers them in just a couple years, like 5 years, something. So this was Philip II's son. He ascended when Philip was assassinated. Philip was assassinated in 36. I think Philip I died in battle, perhaps with the Illyrians. Philip II is assassinated, probably by Persian assassins, although it wouldn't have been unheard of at the time for Alexander to have maybe decided it was time for him to be in charge, because Alexander was arrogant, power-hungry, as evidenced by what we're about to talk about. Nonetheless, an assassin kills Philip II, whoever sent him. We probably will never know. And Alexander assumes control of this brand new Greek empire. Even though Macedon is leading it, most of the empire is made up of Greece, and he takes over. He immediately murders all rivals, kills them and their families, and attacks anyone who challenges Macedon, and forces everyone who had partnerships with Macedon of equality, which had been established under Philip, into a subjugated role. Alexander was not a nice guy. He immediately subjugates and conquers anyone and everyone who either stands or thinks they are equal to Macedon, and yet he considers himself Greek. He doesn't consider this to be Macedonian superiority. He fully considered himself to be a Greek. He was trained by Greeks. He was trained by, was it Aristotle? I think it was Aristotle that actually taught him for years. So, in his way, he was Greek. And he believed he was going to unite all the Greeks for a greater good. That was to defeat Persia and create a huge empire, which is exactly what he does. He forces other Greek city-states that had actually defected, actually left the Macedonian Empire when Philip II died. Alexander goes immediately after them and conquers them very quickly. To demonstrate what happens to those that challenge his authority, he destroyed Thebes. He, burned down the entire city. And this was one of, I think, the 3 largest Greek cities, or 4. Thebes, Corinth, Athens, Sparta. So it was one of the 4 largest Greek cities. He destroys the entire city. Tears down the walls, burned. I mean, he destroys it. He practically wipes the city away. He was not a nice guy. Alexander, in creating what he does create at the time, what he's about to create is the greatest empire ever. In land size, in actual square miles, until modern times. Until pretty much the Mongols, which is, 1,700 years after this, give or take. Yeah. But he does it through massive bloodshed and violence. In 334, he had united pretty much the entire Macedonians and the Greeks, and decides to finally go after the Persians. The great attack, the great victory over the Persians that Philip had promised, never really materialized. But Alexander takes these armies, and he goes after the Persians. And eventually, Alexander will conquer Persia, all of Turkey, Egypt, all the way over into East Asia, almost to China, northern India, a big part of the Middle East, creating an empire that stretches from Europe almost to China, which, by the way, that distance is something like 8,000 miles, something like that, 7,000 miles. Crazy distance. Crazy distance that he does. His success earned him the title of the Great, of course, Alexander the Great. Everyone's aware of that. Based upon his exploits both on and off the battlefield, earned him a heroic reputation. He would drink like crazy. He had a whole harem of women. Had who knows how many illegitimate children. He had an official wife and an official child, I believe, but who knows how many illegitimate children he reproduced or produced. He was the hardest drinker and fighter and partier of anyone. He had massive celebrations, because he became probably the wealthiest emperor in the world for a while because he liberated the wealth of the entire Persian Empire, which was the most powerful empire at the time, which would have had massive amount of money and wealth and treasure. He liberated their treasuries, took all their valuables, and he spent it. He spent it building cities and towns and structures and temples and he just really did. Now he was brilliant. He had physical courage. He was strategic. He was capable. Um, he gave away everything he got, other than what he spent, when I was partying and his drinking binges and his women. He gave away all the land to his soldiers. Every time soldiers would retire, he would give away all the land that he had taken over. He would give away treasure to them so they could set themselves up. As he expanded all across Asia, he would, anytime soldiers would retire, he would settle them in these local towns, which usually took the name of Alexandria. By the time of his death, there were over 30 Alexandrias. Alexandria technically meaning the city of, or the place of Alexander, or the land of Alexander. So he certainly was, maybe the biggest ego in history of the world. Maybe, who knows? Many conquered people. They thought he was wonderful. They thought he was an incredible person. He was treated, even in imagery, he was sort of treated as a god, treated as this powerful. Supposedly, he was very respectful of women. He liked women, apparently, and probably men too. But that's not unusual for the Greeks. Sex and love and lust and relationships was there doesn't really seem to be any type of say we'd use like homophobia. There was nothing like that. Relationships between men and men and women and men and women were perfectly acceptable. I almost said women and women. That was not really. Men had all the privileges. Relationships between women, lesbian relationships, really were. There's really very little evidence of that. That was really a woman's role was to be reproductive and to be there for a man. So men enjoyed all of the opportunities. Men enjoyed all of the enjoyments of life, and women were subservient and secondary. But supposedly he treated the Persian women respectfully. He was an absolute monarch, and he even proclaimed. He even made it obvious in his writings, because in many places he would put up like these stone pillars and like put carvings on them and have these things put up. He wanted to be proclaimed a god, which made sense really, because the Persian emperor was considered to be a god. Persian emperor was portrayed as a god, and so him conquering Persia, which I guess technically made him the emperor of Persia. Not surprising that they were then trying to form him or treat him as though he was a god. Not surprising, considering the places where he was at and how they sort of saw leaders like this. Most Greeks sort of honored this because of his unprecedented feats, his ability to do things beyond human possibility. He really did. He created an empire greater than any that had ever existed. He conquered an enemy that the Greeks had been fighting for centuries and the Greeks had never even really done any significant damage to the Persians, ever. Even defeating a few of their armies, Greece had never really even touched the Persian Empire. Alexander does it in a couple years. Conquers Persia in 5 years. Like it was nothing. When he conquered Persia, conquered northern Africa, conquered parts of the Middle East, and then he got into India. He got right close to the Indus River, I believe, and his troops actually mutinied against him. Now, of course, they didn't kill him. That would have been maybe not allowed. I mean, after all, he was seen by some as a god. Anyone who would have tried to kill Alexander would have probably been killed themselves. But they simply said they wouldn't go any further. And this happens around 326. They didn't want to go any further. I mean, many of these people had not seen home for years. Again, all of this starts back around 336, 335. It's now been 10 years. There are some soldiers that have been traveling with Alexander for a decade and hadn't seen their families, their kids. They wanted to go home. they do eventually force him to return. However, by this point in time, he had already changed the world. And the effects of what Alexander did are long-lasting repercussions into modern times. As he traveled across Asia and India, northern Africa, he established Greek colonies all across this territory, colonies of Greeks, Macedonians, including the Alexandria in northern Egypt, which became a famous center of science, philosophy, and art, for instance. He often included locals in rulership positions, in governmental administration positions, therefore giving a lot of autonomy to local peoples. In essence, he would conquer the territory, but then hand over much of the power to the local lords and governors, the local aristocracy and nobility, which is what they wanted anyway. They're the lords, they're the upper class, they want to rule, they have the wealth and the money and status, that's what they want anyway. So he basically gives that leadership over to them. And then he leaves. And except for a couple of cases, they never see him again. He never comes back. When Alexander leaves a region, he doesn't ever return, except in, again, like a couple of instances. But generally, he's gone. That's it. So these regions are technically part of the Greek Empire, Alexander's Greek Empire, but in many cases, they're nominally autonomous. What he does do is he does bring the world together. He really truly brings East and West together. He spreads Greek influence across Asia. He brings Eastern Asian influences into Greece and the Western world. He really creates this mixing of East and West, which is what we call Hellenism, which is what we'll talk about in a moment. This blending of Eastern and Western cultures. Because Alexander created an empire that stretched across West and East. I know our views are opposite here. You guys looking at me, but across the Western world and Eastern world, he blends and mixes them. Even Alexander dies quickly. He dies just a couple years later. I mean, his massive empire, he doesn't really live to enjoy it. What he did has very long-lasting repercussions. His death in 323 is what we call the end of the Classical Age. That's the date we use for the end of Classical Greek. So we had the Archaic Age of Greece, then we had the Classical Age of Greece, and now we are about to enter into the Third Age of Ancient Greece, which is the Hellenistic Age. This is Alexander. This is a mosaic. Mosaics are incredible works of art. Can't even imagine how long they must take. They're not hours. It's hard to really tell, but in case you see what look like a little bitty, each of these little pieces, each of these little like dots, they're little pieces of glass known as tesserae, I think is what they're called. And they're little bitty pieces of glass. Little ceramic pieces, if you will. And they're put up there one little piece at a time to make these beautiful mosaic pictures. And this is a huge mosaic. This is like a mosaic that's like something like 20 feet across. It's got Alexander, and does it also have Darius? Oh, it doesn't actually show it. But this other part of this actually is Alexander here, and on the other side of this is Darius fighting Alexander. I don't know which Darius it is. There was more than one. Whatever was the last one, I guess. Because that was him, because Darius was the emperor. Now, the mosaic, of course, shows Alexander and Darius fighting against each other one-on-one. Don't know if that ever happened. But, it's a picture. It's an image. It's myth. But Alexander did fight right at the head of his troops. He did. Alexander did fight right at the front of his army. He was known for his courage. It's one of the reasons his soldiers followed him across the world for year after year. He was brave. He really, truly was. Had a death wish, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, this is him being portrayed here, this large mosaic. Darius battling the Persians. We have the mythological creature Medusa here. Some of you probably heard of Medusa with like the hair that snakes, and she turns you to stone as she looks at you. Quite interesting. It shows you the conquest of Alexander here. I mean, look at it. Macedonia, conquering northern Greece, most of Greece. His travels. Here, getting to, let's see, where's the capital? Is that, probably around here, Susa. Susa, that might have been the capital of Persia, maybe. So he does that. He goes down here and conquers Egypt. Yep, conquers Egypt. Then he conquers Mesopotamia. So these regions we've talked about, he conquers all of them. In given time, again, he made it all the way to the Indus, Indian civilization. So what Alexander did was also interesting. He, in essence, conquered, at one point, he conquered all early civilizations. Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, all except for the one we haven't really talked about, which is China. Given time, though, had he not been turned around by his troops, I mean, Alexander was still a young man. Had he been able to, given time, he would have probably conquered northern India and would have probably gone all the way to China. He was headed east, buddy. He wasn't going back until he was forced to. He would have probably conquered all the way to China. I don't know. I don't really know. Maybe there's writings that actually tell what his plan was. But it certainly looked like he was just going to keep going. But he eventually got turned around here, the mutiny in 326. He gets turned around. He ends up going back here to Patala. Going back here, he makes it back. Persepolis. That actually was the capital, I think. I think Persepolis was the capital of Persia. And he keeps heading back, and then he actually gets to Babylon. And he dies in 323. No one knows how he died. There's several stories about it. It seems as though he just didn't wake up one day. Maybe someone poisoned him, not surprising. But he also was an incredibly hard drinker and partier, used drugs, drank all the time. He had sex. Again, he had a whole harem of women. So he might have got a VD. He might have had alcohol poisoning, cirrhosis of the liver. He might have been poisoned. I mean, who knows? But he dies there in 323 at Babylon. Alexander the Great. All right. Alexander's gone. He left no heir officially. I think he had a young boy, a young kid, but this massive empire, he had all kinds of generals. They were not going to allow a child to take over. I believe these three generals, if I have all of them on here, Antigonus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy, these were the lead generals in Alexander's empire, his immediate subordinates, if you will. They murdered his family. They murdered the young boy, his wife, I think his mother, too. I think his mother was with him. Killed them all. Or, someone might have gone back and killed his family back in Macedonia. Nonetheless, with his death, there was no successor other than the generals, and they simply split his empire into three new kingdoms. The Antigonid Kingdom, the Seleucid Empire, and the Ptolemaic Empire. And I'll talk about each one of those as we go along. Antigonus takes Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, the Near East, basically the Middle East, the Near Middle East, Macedonia, and Greece. That becomes part of the Antigonid. Seleucus takes Persia. Let's just keep it simple and say Persia. So what was Persia becomes the Seleucid Empire. And then Ptolemy takes Egypt. So the Middle East, most of it, and Persia, and Western India, Mesopotamia, all that comes part of the Seleucid. Ptolemy takes Egypt, and then Antigonus takes the western part of the empire that goes from Anatolia into Greece. And we see these three empires. They had no legitimate claims. They were not family. None of them were family to Alexander. And the way it worked back then was typically hereditary. Well, they took care of that by killing his son. So since there was no real official claim, they simply ruled by might. They simply took over and ruled through their own personal, what we call personal monarchy. They all three named themselves kings over these new kingdoms. Three new kingdoms formed. So literally, as soon as Alexander's empire was built, he dies and all is fractured and collapses. So his empire, as we know it, the great expanse of his empire, lasted 3 years. 3 years. So for 3 years, it was the greatest empire until modern times. In size. They ruled through military power, prestige, ambition. Now, they were foreign kings because they were all Greek. They were all generally what we think of as Greek. And so they were ruling in foreign lands. They were ruling in the Middle East, in Persia, India, Egypt. They were not locals. So they were foreigners ruling an empire in foreign lands. They needed strong armies, they needed effective administrators, and they needed close ties to all the local governors, the local elites. That's how they maintained their power. They maintained their power by forming close ties with the local power bases in each of the different regions. Now, they still had Alexander's army. That's why they were able to maintain. That's why they were able to say, hey, it's our kingdom. We're in charge. They're able to do that because each one still had a big chunk of Alexander's army. So they still had this big army, which allowed them to enforce their might. These royal armies, these navies required vast revenues for artillery and warships and weapons and military technology and mercenaries and land and soldiers. They really had to create, because Alexander didn't really do this. They had to create empires out of pretty much just conquered land. Alexander just took over the land, and then he moved on. He moved on to the next region and just kept on going, leaving most of the power in locals' hands. Well, these three generals had to come back and reestablish the power, and they had to establish it through might and force, and then they had to build supply lines and build cities and create a bureaucracy, create a government. They had to, almost from the ground up, create new civilizations in each of these places, governed by Greek authority, because these guys all still governed as Greeks, even though 99% of the population was not Greek. They used lots of locals, and they also did another interesting thing. They actually brought a lot of Greeks from Greece and actually transplanted them to these new regions. So people were brought from thousands of miles away, basically taken as either under contract or even as slaves sometimes, forcibly relocated, and then moved to regions that were thousands of miles away from Greece and said, this is where you live now. This is your new home. This is not an uncommon thing either for large empires, to forcibly migrate and relocate large populations. Because what they want is they want their culture to take hold. And they feel like their people will be more obedient than locals. Because the locals don't speak the same language, often don't worship the same gods, don't listen to the same music. I mean, literally everything's different. They don't speak, they don't read, they don't write, they don't talk, they don't worship, their culture, everything's different. And so what you do is they will relocate thousands of locals from your homeland out into these new conquered regions, thousands of miles away. The Greeks did this, Romans did this, lots of other peoples did this, to help pacify the locals, to have more obedient people, and to help instill their culture on the local population. They did this. They did this with Greeks and Macedonian peoples all across their different empires. They would collect taxes, and, basically life went on as normal. Now the Seleucids, and especially the Seleucids and the Ptolemaics, those under Salusis and Ptolemy, they often used a lot of locals too, as I mentioned. They used a lot of local elites, a lot of urban elites. They had to. They were so far away, and the locals, they knew all the traditions, and they had all the money. And the reality is the locals had the support of the population. And if you couldn't get the local elites on your side, well, they might just rise up and try to overthrow you. They might try to build their own armies. It could get really ugly. So they did this. Many people thought a good career was joining with the Greeks, because the Greeks were wealthy and powerful and a lot more worldly than your typical local person was. So many people thought it was a good career move, actually working with the Greeks, assisting the Greeks, joining with the Greeks, being a sympathizer to the Greeks, if you will. Quite interesting. Now, they did often still live separately. You often find that the Greeks and the non-Greeks didn't. They often would still live in separate places. They didn't mingle a lot. Different Greeks and non-Greeks at first. Over time, they all blend together. Over time, over the centuries, Greek and non-Greek all become one. But initially, lots of animosity, lots of mistrust of different groups. I mean, could you imagine if just suddenly, like here in America, if just suddenly 1,000,000 people from, I don't know, China, for instance, or Russia, were just suddenly relocated right in the middle of our country. Boom, here's 1,000,000 people. These are now part of our country. They don't speak our language. They don't look like us. They don't talk like us. They don't worship the same religion. Their culture is different. Everything about them is totally different. And suddenly, boom, they're right in the middle of here, and we all have to find a way to work together, to live together. And it's forcible. We don't have a choice. The government said you have to do it. You don't have an option. There's a huge period of adjustment. It would take years or even decades before we would find these people starting to trust each other and work together. Hell, if they even would. Sometimes you never know; they might not even do it. So this immigration was pretty big. This big immigration. They would also do other things, which if you look back on that slide, they would also do other things. They would. Let me look at this again. Last thing I want to mention is they would also build structures to make it look more Greek. They would build gyms. They would build temples. All kinds of stuff to make them look like they were Greek cities. So they would build these things when the Greek people would show up. The Greeks would show up, they would start building structures just like they had back in Greece, literally thousands of miles away. We find gyms, we find temples, we find theaters in places as far away as Eastern Asia, Western China, places 5,000 miles from Greece. And we find things that are Greek. Greek architecture, Greek statues, Greek temples. 5,000 miles from Greece. What the hell? How'd that happen? Hellenism. The spreading of Hellenism, these Hellenistic kingdoms. They brought the Greek culture with them to these places, sometimes by force. And the people, sometimes by force. And they spread this Hellenism all across Central Asia. All the way to India, all the way to the edge of China, Northern Africa. Yeah, quite interesting. Quite interesting. There it gives you the idea here. You have the Ptolemaic, which is Egypt down here. The Seleucid, which is pretty much what was Persia. Generally what we think of as Persia. And then up here we have the Antigonid, which is just what is basically Greece and a little bit of Asia Minor here. Asia Minor. We think of as Asia Minor here, which is, I think, Anatolia, right? Now, Alexander made it all the way to the Indus. So by 240, which is, 60 years after Alexander's death, all of this has already been lost. But Alexander made it all the way to the Hephaestus and the Indus River here. So all this has already been lost 60 years after his death. We have a bunch of independent kingdoms up here. They're associated with the Greek kingdoms, Seleucid, Ptolemaic, and the Antigonid, but they're generally independent already. We know Bactria was actually part of Alexander's empire originally, because we find multiple cities in Bactria that have all those Greek architecture. That wouldn't have happened if Greek peoples didn't live there, if Greek architects didn't live there, if there wasn't Greek leaders that wanted these structures built. Temples and gymnasia and theaters, all the way to Bactria, almost to the edge of China. So this would have been part of Alexander's empire as well, all of this. So a lot of it's already been lost. Again, these people weren't Alexander. But don't get me wrong, even if Alexander had lived, could he have actually held together this empire? No. There would have been no way. There was no possible way in ancient times he could have held an empire together that was 6,000 miles across, 8,000 miles. It was impossible. There would have been no way. So it would have fallen apart anyway. It might have held together longer had Alexander, lived to a ripe old age, but it was doomed to collapse at some point, sooner than later. No way around it. So the layers of Hellenistic society. Hellenistic society was divided into a very distinct social hierarchy. The royal household occupied the top, followed by Greek and Macedonian elites, then the indigenous urban elites, then you usually have a large group of merchants, artisans, and then laborers at the bottom, slaves as well. Slaves were excluded from the normal aspect of society, normal bounds of society, but their labor was still important. Lots of slaves, so that was still very important. Most of the poor continued to live in small villages in the countryside, working the land to support the farming to support the urban population. So that was typical there. Life for a typical common poor person would not have changed much under the different governments, the different hierarchies. Most lived on the edge of subsistence, working the land to produce enough food to feed themselves, and then, of course, the urban city populations. Inadequate amounts of grain and vegetables, rarely getting meat. Life of the poor was life of the poor. Now, in the Seleucid and Ptolemaic, the rural population sort of lived as dependent farmers working the king's estates. In the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires, all land was supposedly owned by the kingdom, owned by the emperor. Therefore, these were the peoples, as they would call them, just the very generic name for the common people. There was no democracy, no type of individual rights, no education. You were simply poor commoners living under the authority of an authoritarian emperor. Workers were not allowed to move away. They couldn't abandon their farms. They were stuck. I'm still talking about the peoples here. They owned quotas of produce to the king. That's how they paid their taxes and food. Very little chance to escape poverty. So the vast majority of the population were stuck in their positions. And this is pretty much maintained for the next, 2 millennia. Next 2,000 years. This doesn't really change. In Western Asia, Europe, Northern Africa, the peoples are pretty much always the peoples. Poor laborers, poor farmers, very little opportunity for social status change, very little wealth, and you were pretty much stuck as subjects of the king or emperor. Women's status pretty much depended entirely upon their rank. The only women that had any status of any sort would have been upper class women. You could attain wealth. You could attain influence. But again, it was pretty much connected to your family. While there might have been a little social mobility for like merchants or business people, shopkeepers might have had an opportunity to accumulate some wealth. That would have been pretty much only in the urban environment. And so for women, any status you had, wealth you had, was associated with your family or your husband or your father. We do see a few interesting things in the Antigonid, the Greek part of the empire. We actually occasionally have seen a queen, a rare queen, and even a handful of women in governmental positions. We see that a little in the Antigonid, a little bit in the Ptolemaic Egypt, where Egypt already had a history of women having some authority. There were, on rare occasions, there was actually female pharaohs of Egypt. There's a couple of those. The last pharaoh of Egypt, Cleopatra, was a woman. So, in places closer to Greek in Egypt, you see a slight more opportunity for women. to attain authority or status or wealth. But the further you got away into Central Asia, it seemed the less opportunities women had, and the more likely women were simply to be secondary, subservient, or simply, if they were poor, just one of the peoples, not given any status. Women remained under legal control of men, and again, it was still a situation where it was common to expose daughters, to get rid of daughters, to just put them out in nature, in the farms, in the woods, to just leave them on city streets. Still a society that valued boys far over girls. Die or become slaves, prostitutes. Yeah, it was a rough life for women. It was. Women were seen and used for reproduction and property in most cases. The wealthy owned all the money, all the power. This was not, again, even though, ironically enough, these are societies. These three kingdoms are generally ruled by Greeks. This is not the Athenian democratic Greeks. That is gone. That's a day of the past. Maybe in the city of Athens, there's still some form of democracy, but in the Antigonid, Seleucid, and Ptolemaic empires, these are empires ruled with an iron fist by an emperor, with a strong, powerful military and government, a very authoritarian society, where there is no real social mobility other than, again, a handful of people like merchants. But other than that, so all the status, wealth, and power, governmental decisions, lawmaking was all held in the hands of the elite, the wealthy. We don't really see this dissemination of wealth to the masses, but we do see some philanthropy. And this is sort of traditional in Greek society. It's the same thing I talked about before. You build a public space or a public park or a gymnasia, and you do it for status. You do it and you make sure your name is on it, your family name is on it, everybody in the city knows who built it. So we do still see that continuing idea of the wealthy having to give back to the poor, not to elevate up the poor, but basically just to give them some social institutions, to give them some food, some housing, parks. It is philanthropy, but for status. It isn't just entirely benevolent giving back to the people. We do see some of that towards the less fortunate. We do see them donating funds for schools, temples, doctors, relief from disasters. But ultimately, it was all with ulterior motives. It was about increasing prestige and status and authority of their family and of their position in society. In other words, they were sort of competing. They were competing with the other elites to see who could be the most popular elites among the people. But it was still very condescending, and it wasn't, giving someone food today, to use that adage, give a man food today, you feed him, you feed him today, teach him how to fish, you feeds him for life. All they cared about was giving him food for the day. They had no interest in teaching him how to fish, as the metaphor, right? As the metaphor would go. This does become necessary at some point because there are so many poor. There becomes such a mass of poor. At some point, it's certainly clear that 90% of the population plus was poor. So if you didn't do this and feed them and give them, and later empires, the Roman empires had a name for this. It was called bread and circuses. Basically, you entertain the poor masses and you give them food to keep them from rioting and overthrowing the government. Because the poor outnumbered the upper classes, 10 to 1. So you just sort of had to pay them off without giving them money, but like free entertainment and food. And that would keep them pacified, if you will. We see that being pretty common practice in the turn of the millennia. The turn of this, 2,000 years ago, we see it being pretty common. We see it in China. We see it in Rome. We see it in these empires. And this is all really caused because of the abundance of food. There is so much food available. It's really ironic. There's so much food available, and yet there's so many people that are poor and barely surviving. But there's enough food to keep reproduction going, and the populations keep growing as they expand and grow more food and grow more crops and take over more land. So even though it isn't like everyone's starving, everyone is basically living on what we call subsistence. They're getting just enough food to live. No abundance, no luxury, no dessert, if you will. They're getting just enough to live. And that enough to live also means it's enough to reproduce. And the population keeps growing. Again, by 2,000 years ago, we're talking about these populations have millions and millions of just poor people. They might have been common laborers, common farmers, but they were everywhere. They were the majority population of all these empires. The vast majority population of these empires. So a big focus of government and institutions across the entire ancient world by this time period, when we now have populations in the millions and tens of millions across Asia, Europe, and Northern Africa, a big focus of government is simply to keep the masses in line, to keep them from rioting, overthrowing, and bringing down society. Big part of it was. These poor really had no political voice. They had no ability to demand reforms. We see life of poor people living in poverty, poor farmers and laborers, pretty consistent for the next 2 millennia. For most of the next 2,000 years, this is the way it is in Asia, Central Asia, Western Asia, and Europe. An elite ruling a mass of poor. That becomes the pretty standard way society looks from China all the way over to the Roman Empire, which we'll be talking about next time. We don't really ever see democracy again. Not for, well, hell. Truthfully, we don't see democracy again, real democracy, for 2,000 years. Not really. Alexander did that. Don't get me wrong, we can examine Athens, and we can see Athens was already starting to fall out of favor with democracy. But it was still holding on. Not all of Greece, just a few city-states like Athens, a few others. But the rise of Alexander pretty much shut the door on anything we think of as democracy. He ended it. This experiment the Greeks had in Athens for 200 years, more than 300 years. It was gone. Alexander destroyed that. And we don't really see it rise again for a very long time. End of democracy. Cleopatra. Oh, let's see if I went past that. Let's see if I have it in my notes here. Sculptural Cleopatra. This is a relief, which means it's an actual carving into like a piece of stone. It's not a freestanding carving. It's a relief. This was she was the last of the Hellenistic kings of all. All three empires. The Antigonid Empire fell to the Roman Empire. The Seleucid Empire just collapses under its own weight and falls apart. Part of that also falls to the Romans. But the last of Alexander's successor states, if you will, the last one to fall was the Ptolemaic Egypt. And she was the queen, the last pharaoh of Egypt, around 30 BCE. That is around the time the Romans conquered Egypt, and Cleopatra, I think she committed suicide. I think so. And that was it. That was the end. So Alexander's legacy, his empires, if you will, that he created, lasted basically 300 years. in parts. And she was the last Ptolemaic ruler. She was a ruler of Egypt. We consider her a Ptolemaic ruler because she was of the bloodline from Ptolemy, descended from Ptolemy, supposedly. Yeah. All right, last thing we'll talk about in this chapter would be philosophy and science. And that's how we'll end the chapter in this last section, B and, looks like B and C, philosophy and science. All right. So we're talking about the Hellenistic world here. This is still talking about the Hellenistic world. So in the Hellenistic period, people sought personal tranquility amid monarchs' restlessness, threatening forces. What's that mean? It's really the same thing we talked about with other societies. The more there's chaos and violence and warfare, we almost always see a golden age of philosophy, intellectual pursuit, and science and technology appear. It's people's response to the violence. It's a way of finding an escape from the violence and constant turbulence and instability in society. Or it's a solution. People are trying to find a solution, not an escape, but they're actually trying to find an alternative. Is there an alternative to all the violence and warfare and death and destruction? Sometimes it's an alternative to the government. Sometimes philosophy is a new way of governing, or a suggestion of a new way of governing, because so many people feel the government is oppressive. And all three of these empires were generally oppressive empires. They were empires ruled by emperors. Some of them even thinking themselves gods, god kings. So philosophy became for the masses. More and more people studied it. Many people live for a philosophical idea, probably ever than before. Again, looking for an escape, looking for a purpose in life outside of all the violence, warfare, and constant instability we see in these Hellenistic empires after the fall of Alexander. We see him move away from metaphysics, sort of the ether and trying to understand how the cosmos works, to much more materialistic, much more down-to-earth ideas, what we simply call materialism. A doctrine asserts that everything made of matter exists. In other words, it's about the real world. It's not about a metaphysical, an imaginary world, a theoretical world, a utopia. It's about the real physical world around us. The material world we can touch and feel, and we know it exists because we can see it, we can feel it, we can taste it, we can lay on it, we can pick it up, we can drop it. We know it's real. Philosophy generally falls within three categories. This Hellenistic philosophy: logic, physics, or ethics. Logic is the process for discovering truth. Physics is, at its most basic, the fundamental truth about the nature of existence. Modern science, we'd call it like the laws of science, the laws of the universe. Like gravity. What are the laws that make up the physical world? Gravity being a very important one. This idea of physics and ethics. Ethics is how humans should achieve. How did humans achieve happiness? Through the use of logic and physics. You might think, what does happiness have to do with mathematics and physics? Well, physics are trying to understand the true laws of how everything works and operates, and so if you understand that, then ideally, I guess, you can have a happy life. You can use logic, which discovers the truth, and then based upon the actual truth of existence and how nature works, that's how you lead an ethical life. You can be happy. Simply put, you know what's true and untrue, what's right, what's wrong. It might be a simplistic way to think about it, but that was how they thought about it. If we can understand what's true, then we'll always understand what to do. Hey, that sort of rhymed. If we know what's true, then we know what to do. I don't know. Whatever. And this is, by the way, this is still very idealized. Because the idea that if we know the truth, we're always going to make the right decision. What kind of bullshit is that? I mean, really? Even when we know right from wrong, how many times do we make the wrong decisions? Even though we know what's the right thing to do, how many times do we not do that? Either because we're lazy, procrastinating, we're selfish, we're scared, we're jealous, we're, you know, it doesn't benefit us. We do it to spite. I mean, how many times, honestly, do we go through life and we know the right thing to do, but we don't do it? It's a thing we deal with every single day. We all do. So ideally, using logic and physics, you'll always make the right ethical decision. But the key word there being ideally. How often do we really do that? The two most influential schools of thought were Epicureanism and Stoicism. Epicureanism and Stoicism. These reached a very wide audience because between the two of these, they applied to pretty much everybody. Almost everybody could find some aspects of Epicureanism or Stoicism that applied to them, that they agreed with, that they sort of felt they understood, or that worked with their lifestyle. Even women and slaves, not just free people, not just men, not just free males. There are some aspects of these two areas, these two broad. Okay, we have the areas of philosophy. These are what we call schools of philosophy. These schools of philosophy, Epicurean and Stoicism, applied to everybody in some way or another. Most people could see themselves within one of these. Now, Epicureanism was named for its founder, Epicurus. Epicurus. He lived from around 341 to 271. He taught that all matter existed or consisted of microscopic atoms. Yes, that's the word he used. In random movement, and the human should not fear death, because all death is a rearranging of the atoms. So that's all it is. Don't fear death, because all it is when you die is your atoms are rearranged into some other form. You never really die. In a way, that's true. When you die, your body simply becomes, assuming you're buried, you eventually decompose, you become part of the soil, you're ingested by bugs and animals, and, you just, eventually what is you as a human body is just reprocessed through the soil, through the animals, through life, and eventually the atoms that make you up will be part of a cornstalk growing, a tree, a bee, maybe even another human at some point. So if you take the soul out of it, we are constantly reincarnated because there are no new atoms in the universe. Every single atom, every single piece of matter that exists in the universe was created at the beginning of the universe. There never will be any more. There always is. It's always a consistent amount of matter and energy, this matter-energy conversion. It's consistent in the universe. Now, of course, they don't understand all that. But still, this idea that this Epicurus came up with the idea that all matter is made up of little bitty atoms that we can't see in a random pattern, and they all just make up everything, that's actually revolutionary. Because that's in essence what it is. We're all made up of molecules, which are made up of atoms. Hell, that's look at the periodic table. That's what it is. It's just a list of all the different atoms, all the different elements, So he was pretty incredible thinking about this. And it is incredible because scientists in Europe, the scientific revolution doesn't come about for about 2,000 years to where they really start defining what atoms are and molecules are. So he came up with these ideas 2 millennia before Europeans really figured it out. So it also taught that all human and all knowledge must be empirical. Empirical meaning you have to actually study, you have to study it, you have to see it, witness it, experiment. It's through sight and perception and experience. Simply put, if you can't see it, it's not real. You can't touch it, it's not real. He also believed in pleasure. He also believed people should be happy. People should be happy, they should be pleasure, they should take care of themselves, not to indulge, not to go overboard, but just you should enjoy your life. You should have this absence of disturbance. In other words, try to live a stress-free, happy, joyful life, if possible. He encouraged people to withdraw from society. He encouraged you to spend a life with friends, companions, and to avoid war and violence, to only be around people that make you happy. Interesting stuff. Really is. Stoicism, a little different. Based on the belief that fate controlled our life, that we were controlled by the fates. You could still pursue virtue. You could participate in public life, as opposed to Epicureanism, sort of withdraw from public life to get away from all the violence and chaos of the world around us. Sort of withdraw. Only have people that are close, that you trust around you, that make you happy, that are going to make your life better. Stoicism is really the opposite of that. It's about public life. It's about public engagement, public service. Soldiers were often Stoics. It's about service and helping and having a public life and standing up for good and virtue, having self-control, courage, justice, being very temperate, if that's the right word to say, even-handed, fair. Stoicism. Some Stoics even advocated equal rights for women. They suggested a unisex lifestyle, to where men and women would dress the same, look the same, cut their hair the same. They didn't believe in marriage. Procreation was just simply for the purpose, or sex was simply for the purpose of reproduction. You would not have sex except for reproduction. It wasn't about enjoying it. Sex had a purely utilitarian purpose. No marriage, no family. Just have children, and then children were for the sort of the state. The children were really for the purpose of advancing society. You know, a lot of people have kids today, it's for the joy of having a child. The joy it brings to your life. Not a Stoic. A child is simply a means to an end of having another citizen in the state, another person continue on to maybe serve in the military, another person to work in the government. Yeah. Ultimately, neither one of these are perfect, of course. They both have some drawbacks. But I don't know if it's me, it sounds like Epicureanism is a lot more enjoyable. At least with Epicureanism, you know, sex was okay. You could enjoy and have sex and whatnot. So they're not the only ones. There's others. There's skepticism and cynicism. It's interesting. We use these words today as are the adjectives. You know, you're a Stoic person, or you're a skeptic, a skeptical person, or you're a cynic. Maybe that's even a noun, I guess. But these are systems of philosophy. These are systems of learning and education. And many people took these as ways of life. They actually governed their entire lives. They would live their entire life as an Epicurean, or a Stoic, or a cynic, or a skeptic. They would live their life that way. They governed all their decisions. Business decisions, family decisions, work decisions, relationships, their jobs. I mean, I know I'm being repetitive there, but it's just every part of their life would be governed by some people who really truly follow these philosophies. Skepticism, it asserted that contradictory nature of human senses. Basically, it kept us from knowing certain about anything. This is what we would use today, the term, the matter of perception. You've heard the term, the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's really skepticism. The idea that the reality of everything's the same, that everything has a certain material composition, materialism, everything is a certain way, everything's governed by laws and logic. Well, skeptics would say, not exactly. They would say that because everyone sees things differently, I guess is the way to look at it. You know, the best example, let's look at politics. Our country is one country. But look at politics. It's appropriate to say Republicans and Democrats see world much differently, do they not? So to say, everything in America, it's the same. I mean, I'm saying if I look at something or I do something or I see something, it's the same thing. If you look at it and I look at it. If we look at a person, we look at a meeting, we look at a gun, we look at a pregnant woman, we look at the flag. They're all the same thing. It's the same person, it's the same weapon, it's the same flag. But depending on your political ideology, you might see it and interpret it entirely different. And that's really what skepticism says, is that there is no definitive truth. Everybody interprets things different and sees things different. Everything is relative to your own perceptions, your own ideologies, your own knowledge, your own learning, your own experiences. And what it boils down to, a skeptic, is nothing can ever be known for sure. Nothing can ever be known for sure. No one could ever really know. Abortion, great option right there. A great decision. People that are pro-life say abortion should happen, it should be allowed, and people that are, that's pro-life would be anti-abortion. Anti-abortion say abortion should not be allowed. And then you have ones that are more for women's rights and believe women should have the right to have an abortion. It's the same woman who's pregnant that wants to have an abortion. But the two views are literally 180 degrees different. So what's true? What's right? A skeptic would say that's the real world really works. You never really know, because everybody sees things differently through their own experiences. A cynic sees, cynic is pretty much the whole, the very radical end of this, where cynic says, reject everything, reject all aspects of normal life, reject all aspects of institution and government and law, reject everything. Be entirely self-sufficient, independent, have no connections with anything, give up all comforts, accept nothing, reject everything. That it's all, none of it really serves you. These are pretty extreme. Most people were not skeptics or cynics. The majority of people would have fallen into either Epicurean or Stoicism. Those were mainstream. Skepticism and cynicism were pretty extreme. If for no other reason that it was very antagonistic. If you tried going through life as a skeptic or cynic, you basically didn't get along with anybody, you didn't agree with anyone, nothing's true, everyone's wrong, I don't trust anybody. I mean, to live the life of a skeptic or a cynic is very isolationist. You pretty much make yourself a loner. Hard to get along with normal society being that way. You pretty much have to live outside or on the fringe of society to be either one of those. Today, you might even make especially cynicism may being synonymous with anarchy. No government, no society, no institution. You have to entirely take care of yourself. Basically, run off and live in a cabin in the mountains with your rifle and hunt squirrel. I don't know. I mean, it's like you want nothing to do with law, government, or society. So skepticism is radical. Cynicism is very radical. Diogenes was interesting. He was actually a cynic. He was maybe the most famous cynic. He slept in a jar. Yeah. He wore other people's clothes. He shit on the streets. He had no shame. He said everything was natural's fine. I don't need to obey any laws or rules of society. Nothing matters other than whatever you want to do. I think that, I don't know the definition of anarchy, but that seems like that might be a definition. Pretty extreme. Pretty extreme. I mean, don't get me wrong. I remember standing in line at Barnes and Noble years ago, Christmas time. You know, they have all that crap up by the checkout. They're trying to need to buy all these things as you're standing in like a 30-minute line or whatnot. And there was a little brown book sitting there. And it was called Everybody Poops. And I guess that's a little book you were supposed to like read with your kids, and it was, you know, simple, you know, a couple words on a page just to teach about the, you know, that's a natural process. Because some kids have a hard time with it. Some kids, they feel shame or whatnot about it. So it's a natural process. So yeah, everybody poops. So why be embarrassed about it? I don't know. I'm not going to go poop on the street, but that's just me. All right. The last thing we'll talk about, scientific innovation. Scientific investigation was separated from philosophy in this period, in the Hellenistic world. Science and philosophy were not synonymous. It's notable because in ancient times, very often science and philosophy are the same people studying it. We even called it that, or whoever called it that. Natural philosophy is really what becomes science. Now, science certainly advanced and benefited from what Alexander did. Alexander, who spent a lot of money building cities and towns, he paid for engineers, built lots of structures. He brought the best scientists and used the best scientists, mathematicians, engineers, everywhere he went. Again, he conquered all the greatest places in the world. I mean, India, Mesopotamia, Persia, Egypt, Greece. So he had access through his empire to pretty much all the greatest minds of the time period outside of China. So, given that, he used all this. He actually uses a lot of this learning, this science, this technology. He uses it and hires people to build things, and we see lots of advances in scientific knowledge under Alexander's empire, you know, during his time as emperor and after his death. As a result of what he did, we see lots of scientific innovation. As a result of him pretty much bringing some of the greatest minds in the world together for his purposes. Still, it makes a difference. It really does. Some of the greatest advances at the time came in geometry and mathematics. Euclid. You may have heard of it. There's even a branch of mathematics called Euclidean geometry, named after him. Euclid actually taught at Alexandria in Egypt, I believe. He made revolutionary discoveries analyzing 2- and 3-dimensional space, which would be this Euclidean geometry. Archimedes is another. Archimedes was of Syracuse. Syracuse is... I'm not exactly positive where Syracuse is. He determined the value of pi. He invented a way to manipulate very large numbers. He invented hydrostatics, which is basically the mathematical study of water and pressure, mechanical devices. The Archimedean Screw, if you've ever seen that. It's a way to actually move water uphill. The Archimedean Screw, it's literally just a screw that spins in a water source, and as it moves, it actually draws the water up using surface tension or something like that. I don't know. Ask a mathematician. But it actually allows him to bring water from against gravity and bring it from a lower to a higher. I mean, yeah. These were, for their times, these were geniuses. I mean, these were some of the smartest, most capable people in this time period. Inventing technologies and all kinds of new innovative ideas that no one had ever even come up with or ever thought of before. Another one is Aristarchus. Aristarchus is around the 3rd century BCE. 3rd century BCE. He became the first person anywhere, as far as we know, to argue that the Earth actually revolved around the sun. First person to suggest this. That the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, that the Earth actually went around the sun. Now, later scholars rejected this because his mathematical calculations were wrong. And they were. His mathematical, I mean, of course, he was like, this was early mathematician, right? His calculations were wrong. Simply put, we know that the planets revolve around the sun elliptical, like an oval. He assumed they went around in a perfect circle, which threw all of his calculations off. So it was impossible to prove what he talked about. And when they actually did the math on it, it didn't work. So there's like, well, you're wrong. It doesn't work. But he still believed that the Earth went around the sun and the planets went around the sun, not that the Earth was the center of everything. How are you gonna say that one? Eratosthenes? I'm gonna go with that. He pioneered mathematical geography. He calculated the size of the Earth based upon the shadows cast by objects, and he actually calculated the circumference of the entire Earth almost exactly. The Earth is like 24,000 and some miles around. He got 24,000 miles. He missed it by, I don't know, a few dozen, a few hundred miles, just from using calculations on some objects and their shadows. I have no idea how that even works, how you even do that. But he did, and he was able to calculate the size of the Earth, and that the Earth was round and rotated, and that it was a ball. Bear in mind, this kind of stuff, 2,000 years later, there's people in Europe that still don't believe this, that still don't believe the Earth is round, that still don't believe that the Earth rotates around the sun. 2,000 years later. And there's Europeans that still don't believe the stuff that they were already figuring out thousands of years earlier. Pretty crazy. We see all kinds of other important discoveries. Pneumatics, which is the science of like pressure and air, steam pressure, all kinds of new technologies. Bear in mind, a lot of these technologies could be used for weapons of war. And believe me, they were. Anytime they could take one of these new techs and use it in some way for a military application, they did. We still do it today. In a world today, anytime a new technology comes around, it's often used, if there's an application for it, militarily. We still do it today. Scientists and their patrons are often interested in discoveries more than actual results because they wanted to get the credit for discovering something. Not something they could actually use or practically put to use. They simply wanted to get the credit, the notoriety, the fame, the status, prestige from, hey, I'm a patron, I'm a wealthy patron, I'm paying for this scientist, this philosopher, he discovered something important. I'm responsible for that. I'm the one that paid for taking care of him and put food on his table and shelter, and I paid for his tools and everything. Wealthy patrons often paid for all these philosophers and scientists to work. It was, again, another form of status. The same way they would build a theater, build a gymnasia, or build a pool, a public bath for the masses. It was about status and prestige. In many cases, same thing here. Status and prestige. Pharos was a certainly interesting exception. This was the lighthouse. The famous lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the wonders of the ancient world. This massive lighthouse built in Egypt at Alexandria. It had mirror panels, giant mirrors that would actually reflect the fire. There was a fire burning inside, and it would reflect the fire out as a spotlight to the ships. Pretty impressive, pretty amazing, really. The ancient lighthouse of Pharos at Alexandria. Hellenistic medical researchers discovered the value of measuring pulse in the human body. They could diagnose illnesses. They studied anatomy by dissecting cadavers. Discovery of nerves. They mapped the nerves, the nervous systems. They mapped the internal organs of the bodies, the bones, the muscles. How impressive was this? In the Middle Ages, about 1600 years after this, give or take, many scientists and doctors and medical professionals used sketchbooks of the ancient Greeks from this time period to actually do surgeries and to treat people who were sick. The human body, internal medicine, we would call it today. Sketchbooks that the Greeks did almost 2,000 years earlier, Europeans were still using just a few hundred years ago in schools and academies and universities. That's how advanced these folks were. I mean, I've probably said it before. I often wonder if we'd actually kept advancing and we hadn't stopped, if we'd actually kept advancing our knowledge and our science and just kept moving forward. Could you imagine? I mean, we'd be 2,000 years ahead of where we are now. And a lot of the reason it didn't happen is due to religion. Much of science and knowledge, especially after the creation of Christianity, it conflicted with religious belief, and so much of it was shut down. Much of it was discredited. Like I say, 2,000 years later, and people still were questioning whether the Earth actually revolved around the sun. Most people still didn't believe it. You can think a lot of that for religious belief. That's the way it is. What else we have going on here? Discoveries in science and medicine. Medical knowledge increased. We see a lot of money being spent on this research and technology by the government, which ironically enough is still the way it is today. A great deal of science and research and technology is funded by the government. Billions and trillions of dollars funded by government. So we see the royalty, the elites, the upper class funding this. Quite interesting. They were limited in many cases by their inability to see the actual particles, the actual molecules and atoms. Which, of course, that doesn't come about until we get, I guess, microscopes much, much later. They knew that it was there. They knew matter was made up of little particles. They knew the human body had little things in it we couldn't see. Think of like bacteria and cells. They knew it was there. They believed it was there. They wrote about it. But they couldn't prove it. Because they didn't have the technology. They didn't have the microscopes to do this. They didn't have the ability to see molecules and atoms, to see individual cells or bacteria in the human body. They couldn't do it. They knew it, they believed it, but they simply couldn't prove it. The technology simply didn't exist to see things invisible to the naked eye. However, with all its experimentation, Hellenistic research really helped advance scientific thought towards this idea of really understanding the world around us. It was tough to do. They only could go so far without modern technology. It's interesting. This is the Tower of Winds. This is in Athens. This is actually in Athens at the Agora. It's sort of an example of the focus of science. This was a place that was to study science. It was like a science little institute. They had water clocks, sundials. They had openings in the roof where they could see the stars. They were studying. This was, like early observatories and early schools of science, if you will. They studied the sun, the stars. It was a weather station as well. It was able to measure weather phenomena. Yeah, pretty cool, really. Many of these ideas and technologies used in this tower wouldn't be seen or wouldn't be heard of or wouldn't be discussed again for the better part of 2,000 years. Probably built around the 2nd or 3rd century BCE. And then, with the coming of the Roman Empire, the coming of Christianity, much of it was just simply forgotten, ignored, discredited, not considered important. And for centuries, science and technology just pretty much freeze and don't really advance or move anywhere. They were so advanced, and then they just hit a dead end and didn't go anywhere else for a very long period of time. Anyway, I think that's it, actually. Oh, what do we have here? This is an actual underground healing location. I see this. I don't have it in my notes. Oh, yeah, I do. This is an underground place where people would come to get healing and sleep while doctors worked on them. This is actually a place, it's like a hospital. In essence, it's a hospital. It was actually part of a cult. It was probably a cult known as Asclepius, which is one of the mystery cults in the Hellenistic age. So yeah, I mean, this medical science we even see here is actually related to a religious cult, to the god Asclepius. This was a healing temple. Interesting. And then this leads us into the next chapter. The next 3 chapters are Rome. This shows the Roman takeover of the Hellenistic world, Rome conquering Egypt, the Ptolemaic kingdom, taking over the Seleucid kingdom, taking over the Antigonid kingdom. You can see all of them there. By Macedonia, the Seleucid Empire, the Egyptian Ptolemaic Empire. Eventually, Rome brings them all down. Pretty much single-handedly Ptolemaic and Antigonid. But Seleucid kingdom was greatly weakened already. There was all kinds of turbulence going on in what was Persia, so that was sort of one of those situations where the whole empire was collapsing already, and the Romans just came in and took over part of it, only part of it. But it gives you an idea of what is going to happen to the Hellenistic world as it's conquered by the Romans, much of it, and is heavily influential upon the Roman Empire. Much of the Roman Empire is simply copying the Greeks. That, I believe, is the end. So thanks for going through it with me, and take care, and we will talk again soon.